The following program was made possible by the generosity of those who have determined to hold fast to the true Roman Catholic religion, as expounded by the Roman Catholic Church before the disasters of Vatican II and the so-called New Mass.
Welcome to What Catholics Believe. This is a continuation of our catechetical series. We're now at Lesson 30, The Sins Against Marriage. Separation and refusing the marriage debt. The quotation here is from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. But for fear of fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render the debt to his wife, and the wife also in like manner to the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. And in like manner the husband also hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud not one another, except perhaps by consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to prayer, and return together again, lest Satan tempt you for your incontinency. Now this statement from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, actually tells us about the marriage debt, and it actually refers to the exchange of rights that the man and the woman make during their marriage vows, that they give to each other the rights necessary to bring children into the world, and they accept those rights mutually as well. And so it really is a debt when you give a right. When someone has a right over you, you have a debt to render to them. And so once a man and a woman are married, they actually owe to each other the marriage debt. In other words, the rights that they promised to give on the marriage day, they have an obligation in conscience to render. Or ordinarily, that would oblige them under pain of mortal sin to render that marriage debt when it is reasonably and seriously demanded by their spouses. And so anyone who would gratuitously withhold the marriage debt, the marriage rights, would be committing a mortal sin of injustice. After all, it is a matter of right, and it is a matter of debt, no matter what is due. They would be guilty of a mortal sin of injustice against the marriage vows. So St. Paul expresses it very, very well here in his first epistle to the Corinthians, when he talks about the husband and the wife having each other and being indebted to each other, and that they do not have complete power over themselves, but they've given the right to another, so they are indebted to each other in justice to render the marriage debt. Now he does say that it would be fraud, they would be defrauding each other if they refused the marriage act to each other. But he says that it is possible by mutual consent for the two of them to say, well, we will not press our rights, we will not invoke our rights for a time, that they can practice abstinence for a time. In fact, it is recommended during the Lenten season and on other occasions during the year that the husband and the wife do, if they can, remain continent during that time, but by mutual agreement. It has to be mutual, because if one demands the marriage right, the other one does have the obligation to render the marriage debt. And St. Paul says it should be done for a time only, because, as he says, Satan can use the opportunity to tempt them to seek gratification outside the marriage, and that would be mortally sinful. And so he recommends that if they do, by mutual consent, agree not to press their marriage rights, that they would do so only for a time, so that it not put them into a very grave danger of committing impure sins. Now, it's important to make a note about this too, that the husband and the wife come to the marriage with love for each other, but their love is not the same. When a wife says to her husband that she loves him, it doesn't mean exactly the same as when a husband says to his wife that he loves her. Because a man loves as a man, and a woman loves as a woman. And the man really wants and needs a woman's love, and the woman really wants and needs a man's love. And they are not exactly the same. And because their positions in the marriage are not exactly the same, and their positions in the family are not exactly the same. By a man's psychological makeup, the marriage debt is a very, very important factor in his need for his wife. A man is very jealous of his liberty, and for him to be induced to surrender his liberty and invest his liberty in a woman as his wife and a future family, his children, he needs a very powerful incentive. And so that part of that powerful incentive is provided for the fact that he has a very, very serious need for the consolation and comfort that the wife can give him in the marriage act. The woman, on the other hand, does appreciate the fondness there and the intimacy, but it's not quite the same with her because, of course, conceiving and bearing children is fraught with all manner of discomfort and all manner of pains and sorrows and anxieties that the husband does not have to endure, except the fact that he feels sympathy for his wife. Empathy, maybe not, because as a man, he doesn't have the experience that she does in carrying a child and giving birth to a child, and then the aftermath, having to care for and nurse the child. This burden falls largely on his wife. And the husband is there certainly in supportive and auxiliary capacity. And so the husband should not be surprised to find that his wife regards the marriage debt a bit differently than the way he does. That she may even find it less enticing by far than he does, and even come to find it more burdensome as time goes on. The husband should not find that in his wife, therefore, that she does not love him because she is not as enthusiastic as he is about the marriage debt. But neither should the wife think that her husband doesn't love her if he is enthusiastic about the marriage debt, and that it is very important to him. The wife wants her husband to want her. And she may find it difficult to render the marriage debt and also the consequences, but this is her vocation, to be a wife and mother. She should not think that her husband does not care for her if it seems to her that he is interested in his own gratification in his attention to her. Now, note this, that a wife whose husband notices her, takes notice of her, I should say, and a wife whose husband is interested in her only when he's seeking gratification from her, that wife can feel extremely lonely and very much unloved. She can feel as though the husband regards her as like a pork chop on the plate in the refrigerator, and only when he's hungry does he come looking for her, for his own satisfaction, and then ignores her after that. A woman in that condition, a woman in that situation, is very poor and very lonely, and no wonder that she really feels as though her husband does not really love her. On the other hand, a husband who does seek his wife's comfort, and he does come to her and find that she is making excuses and pushing away and basically that verbally saying that she is not interested, or obviously trying to discourage him, that husband in his own right can feel also very much unloved. And both of them can get to feel as though the other one does not love them, and they can begin to feel very lonely. The rendering of the marriage debt is a very important part of showing that love, and even the requesting of the marriage debt is a very important part of showing that continued love and fondness for each other. But the word love, although it means essentially the same thing for the husband and the wife, involves very different effects, very different consequences. And so they need to be respectful of each other for that. Nonetheless, the principle of the Church is that when one spouse reasonably and seriously demands the marriage debt, the other has an obligation under pain of mortal sin to render the marriage debt. But we have to look at those words reasonably and seriously. Those do qualify. To say seriously demands the marriage debt, well, obviously a husband or a wife would want to marry someone who's very considerate of the spouse and not be the type of person who would say, I demand my marriage rights, and being very, very dictatorial about that, or tyrannical about that. You'd want to marry someone who truly loved you, cared for you, loved our Lord, and had the ability to practice chastity in cases where it is not reasonable to demand the marriage debt. And that's the second word. When one reasonably and seriously demands the marriage debt, involves the reasonability of demanding it. Obviously, to demand the marriage rights in a crowded bus is wrong. To demand the marriage rights in a public place would be wrong. To demand the marriage rights when one has a highly contagious, lethal disease, obviously that's not reasonable. To demand the marriage debt when one is subject to violence and abuse, when the marriage debt itself is being perverted by one partner, that is not reasonable for that person to demand the marriage debt. There are a number of things that make it unreasonable for a husband or a wife to demand the marriage debt. A man who is not supporting his family simply because of his own slothfulness and then demands the marriage debt is not reasonably demanding the marriage debt, because he's not providing the basic sustenance for the family that he has. A wife who doesn't even care for the children that she has, but lets the family fall to rack and ruin, again, it is not reasonable for her to demand the marriage debt under certain circumstances. And so on and so forth. So the reasonability of demanding the marriage debt is an important factor. It's an important qualifier. And one who believes that he or she is being put in a position that is unreasonable by the spouse, where the demand of the marriage debt, it truly is unreasonable, they should consult the parish priest for the sake of their own consciences, to find out for sure whether they have an actual obligation under pain of mortal sin to render the marriage debt or not. There's much more that could be said about this, and in a marriage instruction it would be, but this is not a marriage instruction, so we're not going to go into great detail here. But the husband and the wife have to realize that they are incurring an actual debt to render the marriage act to their spouse when they marry that person. Now, the next heading is divorce, and the quotation is from St. Mark's Gospel, chapter 10. And the Pharisees coming to him asked him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife? Tempting him. But he answering saith to them, What did Moses command you? Who said, Moses permitted to write a bill of divorce, and to put her away. To whom Jesus answering said, Because of the hardness of your heart he wrote you that precepts. But from the beginning of the creation God made them male and female. For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife. And they two shall be one flesh. Therefore, now they are not two, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. And in the house again his disciples asked him concerning the same thing, and he saith to them, Whosoever shall put away his wife and marry another committeth adultery against her. And if the wife shall put away her husband and be married to another, she committed adultery. These statements of our Lord are very clear that marriage is for life, and it is simply not possible legitimately, without sin, that is, to put away one's wife and to find another wife while the one wife is still alive. And that constitutes what is known as perfect divorce, imperfect divorce being mere separation between the two for some grave cause. But perfect divorce, or divortium perfectum, means that they consider that the marriage bond no longer exists, so that they're free to go out and find someone else to marry. That is a grave, grave sin, and ultimately leads to adultery. And then, under birth control, Judah therefore said to Onan his son, "Go in to thy deceased brother's wife and marry her, that thou mayest raise seed to thy brother." He, knowing that the children should not be his, when he went in to his brother's wife, spilled his seed upon the ground, lest children should be born in his brother's name. And therefore the Lord slew him, because he did a detestable thing. This is from the book of Genesis, chapter 38. Now, apart from the meaning of this particular sin, the general point is to practice any form of birth control, to indulge in the marital act in such a way that it could not possibly, that one is making sure artificially that it could not possibly lead to the conception of a child, that it be rendered sterile by human agency, so that by no means could a child be conceived. That is a mortal sin. It is a perversion of the marriage act, because the primary essential purpose of the marriage and the marriage act is precisely to give life. So if someone were to use the marriage act or abuse it, all the time saying the primary purpose, as far as I'm concerned, is my own personal gratification, and I will not allow the conception of a child, and I will deliberately thwart the conception of a child, that is a perversion of the marriage act. It is a very grave, a mortal sin. Number one, what are the sins against marriage? They give you a list here. Refusing the marriage debt, as I said before. Unlawful separation. Divorce. Sinful company keeping. Adultery. Birth control. Abortion. Sterilization. So they've named 8 of the principal crimes committed against the marriage. They mentioned refusing the marriage debt, as we quoted from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We mention also, unlawful separation. A couple can be separated and still claim and realize that they are husband and wife. They're not free to find another husband and wife. But one of them has left, or they maybe agreed to separate and not to live together as husband and wife. Now, unless there's some very grave cause, generally involving a mortal sin, committed by one or the other of them, they have an obligation by virtue of their marriage vows to share what? To share their lives, to share the time of their lives, and to live together. They have an obligation to share the property that they own, that the family needs to function as a family. They have an obligation to share the marriage bed and to actually use the rights that they've given to bring children into the world. Ordinarily, a married couple would have these obligations to share their lives, their property, and the marriage bed. When one of them commits adultery, then that person has broken the fidelity of the marriage, and the other person actually would have a right, therefore, as long as the adultery was a fact, known fact, and the person who did it was culpable, that it wasn't the result of some temporary impairment, for example, with medication or whatever, but somebody was aware of what they were doing and culpable enough to actually commit a mortal sin by doing it. The innocent party would have the right to actually separate in those 3 areas of living together, of sharing property together, and of sharing the marriage bed together. Now, the innocent party could say, well, for the sake of children, I will continue to live with you under the same roof. They could say, but I will not share property with you, so I can't trust you, so you need to deed things to me. And I certainly will not have the marriage debt with you. And they could actually refuse to do that when the other person actually is guilty of breaking the fidelity of the marriage by committing adultery. Very grave consequences. They could even say, I will not share the marriage bed with you, nor will I share property with you, nor will I even live with you any longer. One of us is going, I'm leaving or you're leaving, but I will not live with you who have betrayed me by adultery. So they would have the right to do this. However, they do in fact care about the children. They're concerned about the children, and they want to preserve them and protect them. And so I think you'll find that in such cases often they are willing to live together because the children need their mom and their dad. And so they do stay there as mom and dad, even if they divide the house up and or sleep in separate bedrooms now, or legally separate before the law. For the sake of the children, they'll often continue living together. But unless there is some grave fault on the part of one or the other, would be unlawful for one spouse just to declare, well, I'm not going to live with you anymore, or I'm not going to share property with you anymore, or I'm not going to share the marriage bed with you anymore. There has to be ordinarily some grave fault. Now, again, getting back to the highly contagious lethal disease, it is possible that there could be a situation where the one spouse and the children are in danger, not because of any fault on the part of the other spouse, but just because of some situation that has arisen involving, let's say, serious disease. Well, it would be unreasonable to expect the wife and the children to continue living with a husband who has a highly contagious, lethal disease. That it would be unreasonable for the husband to be forced to live with a wife who had a highly contagious, lethal disease and have the children living there too. However, the husband and the wife still are bound to care for each other and to provide for each other. And they would have an obligation to provide for each other's needs, even under those circumstances. They couldn't just abandon each other. That would still be unlawful. So if in doubt, they should talk to the parish priest and ask not what he thinks, but what the church says, because that's the obligation of the priest, to know what the church says, not what he personally thinks or provides his own personal opinion. He has to be able to give them more than that. Of course, thirdly, divorce, saying we're not married any longer, the marriage bond is over because I don't want it anymore. That would be divorce. It would be a mortal sin, and it would lead to joining another person, and when they did, there would be adultery. If they presume to try or pretend to marry another person, that would be adultery. And so, again, these are grave crimes. I realize not before the human law necessarily, but before God's law. And God ultimately is going to judge the soul of each individual and will declare what the crime is and punish it. And no human law is going to stand in the way of that. God will declare who has been faithful to his law, and he will reward them for that. And there is a great reward for being married and living faithful to one's marriage vows. Number 4 is sinful company keeping. This has to do primarily with people before they're married. If they're hanging out, as it were, with members of the opposite sex, and they're keeping company in such a way that they're putting each other in serious moral danger, being alone with each other, late at night, in compromising places, seeking compromising entertainment, and so on, where they find that they are tempted to take liberties that they have no right to take, intimacies that belong only to a man and a woman who have vowed to be faithful to each other as long as they live. Unfortunately, young people today are tempted to make a mockery of their marriage vows, even before they pronounce the marriage vows. months before the marriage date arrives, they are perhaps indulging in intimacies, and perhaps even already performing what is really meant to be the marriage act. And basically, they're just glorified friends. Even if they're fiancéed, they do not have the bond to each other that they will have when they've made their marriage vows. And even as they're walking up the aisle, they can still change their minds. And when the priest says, "Do you take so-and-so as your lawful wife or your lawful husband?" they can say, "I do not," or "I will not," and they can turn and walk away. For them to indulge in intimacies with each other that are meant to be exclusively for a married couple is thievery. It is stealing what they have no right to, what they had no right to give and had no right to take without the marriage vows. And the responsibilities that come with it, they do not have any right to the authority or the benefits of the marriage vows. The authority that comes with the marriage vows, the rights that come with the marriage vows, come with obligations. And until they have those obligations of the marriage vows, they cannot have those rights. Not legitimately. And so what you'll find is young people actually making a mockery of their marriage vows. Basically saying, look, we're not married yet, but, we're serious, and we're going to get married eventually. Maybe we even have a wedding date set. So it's okay for us to indulge in even the marriage act. And you know what? Basically what they're saying is the marriage vows really are a mere formality. They don't really mean anything. After all, if we can do this now, why do we even bother with the marriage vows? What difference does it make? If we can do these things with each other before we make the marriage vows, then obviously the marriage vows don't mean much, either to you or to me. And so on the day we make our marriage vows, we'll either be blushing with shame because we realize that we have made a mockery of the very vows we're making, or we will not be blushing with shame because we still think they don't really mean much. It's just a formality. It's an occasion to have a party. That's all. Nothing more than that. But beware marrying someone who's willing to do that. Beware marrying someone like that. Oh, sure, the man might say, well, don't worry. After we're married, I would never do this with anybody I'm not married to. But the girl should say, well, wait a minute. You already are. You're not married to me yet, and you're already doing this. So how can I trust you to be faithful to the marriage vows after you make the marriage vows, when I can't trust you to be faithful to the marriage vows before you make the marriage vows? And that goes for the girl too. For both of them. How can they trust each other to be faithful to the marriage vows after they make them, if they're not faithful to them before they make them? It doesn't work that way. And married couples find out that what they did before their marriage does haunt them after they're married. And they should have seen some serious warning flags already before they were married because of the activities that they were getting involved in. One or the other of them should have seen something wrong, or both of them, in each other, but they should have seen something wrong in themselves too, that we're not ready for this because we're not grown-ups yet. We don't have self-control yet. One has the myth that everything goes in marriage, and it doesn't. Quite the contrary. You need as much self-control, often more self-control within marriage than you did before you were married. And that's a fact. It's not as though everything is permissible within marriage. Quite the contrary. There are still necessary needs for self-control, and that's what the couple need to do. They need to show that they have the self-control, that they're grown-ups, and they actually have that self-control before they get married. If the boy and the girl are only a boy and a girl, they're not ready to get married. If they show that they do not have self-control yet, if a girl realizes that she's not marrying a man, but she's marrying a boy, she's got to stop right there. And if a man realizes he's marrying not a woman but a girl, he's got to stop right there. Because if your partner in courtship is not grown up and growing up quickly, then you certainly don't want to marry a boy, and you don't want to marry a girl. A man wants to marry a woman, and a woman wants to marry a man. That is, grown-ups who can accept the responsibility at the same time they're accepting the rights and can be trusted. Remember, when you love somebody, you give them amazing power over you. Perhaps the most serious decision you'll ever make to determine whether you're going to go to heaven or going to go to hell is the decision to get married and whom to marry. Who are you going to marry? That's the most critical decision. It's terrible to want to be married and not be married and not be able to be married. But it's much worse to be married and not want to be and realize you made a terrible mistake and married the wrong person. So I want you to take a very, very long, hard look at this person and really think this through and ask oneself very often in courtship, is this right? Is this of God? Do I have a relationship that is going to be blessed by God or going to be cursed by God? Because it betrays God and it mocks Him and it commits sins against Him and His holy sacrament of matrimony. This is what the young people need to ask themselves. They need to ask themselves, do I have the self-control necessary to be a husband and a father? Do I have the self-control necessary to be a wife and a mother? And they might ask themselves also in their own courtship, if I, 20 years from now, have a son or a daughter, and I realize they're doing what I'm doing in my courtship with this person, how would I advise them? Would I tell my son or my daughter, don't do these things? Please, would I plead with them, don't do these things? The very things that I'm doing in my courtship? Well, again, a man and a woman need to kind of look forward and say, well, what advice would I give my own child? What kind of person would I want my son or daughter to be? What kind of courtship would I want my son or daughter to have? Well, they should apply those same rules to themselves. They've got to show they've grown up and they have self-control. If they don't respect each other, they don't respect themselves, they don't respect Almighty God. And this is a formula for disaster if they should try to walk down the aisle to get married. Now, after that, we find adultery, and unfortunately, we'll find those who indulge in sins before they're married, struggling with temptations to adultery after they're married. Again, because they just don't have that self-control that they need. None of the imagination, let alone of the eyes and the body. Even the imagination, what thoughts they're willing to think, what sinful temptation thoughts they're willing to think. The very thought of adultery has to be absolutely anathema to a young man or young woman getting married. Well, any man or any woman of any age getting married. It can be single adultery or double adultery. Single adultery is where one person who is married to another actually has marital relations outside the marriage with a third person who himself is not married. But if you have two married couples and one, let's say the woman, has marital relations with the man, the woman of one marriage has marital relations with the man of another marriage, you've got two marriages involved. That's double adultery. And the sinfulness of that is almost inconceivable. God Himself used that through the prophets to show the apostasy of the Hebrews in the Old Testament in consorting with the pagan nations, as though they were committing adultery with them. You see, when you have, let's say, woman A married to man, shall we say, A1, and we have woman B married to man B1, then if the man from the first marriage, who is A1, decides to have relationship with the woman B, who is married to someone else, they both commit multiple mortal sins at the same time. What mortal sins? Well, the man violates his obligations of fidelity to his own wife, but he also steals the rights of another man, the man who's married to the woman that he committed adultery with. And she, the adulterous woman, not only sins against her own husband, committing adultery, in violating the marriage, but she also commits a mortal sin of injustice toward the adulterous man's own wife, who alone has the rights to his affection and that intimacy that he gave away to this other woman, another man's wife. So they each commit multiple mortal sins in that regard. They also give horrible scandal to any who might know about this. They certainly scandalize each other. They will scandalize each other's spouses, not if, but when it becomes known. And they will scandalize all their family and all their friends when word gets out of what is happening here. They'll be scandalized by it. And they also put at risk the welfare of their spouses and their children, because the consequences are terrible for a family when there's adultery. What it does to the innocent spouse, the impact it has on the children's whole lives, just horrible. And when they selfishly take each other in their arms and commit adultery with each other, they are just wantonly putting all of these people at risk. Each other's families at risk, all their children and the innocent spouses, they're threatening to just murder them all emotionally. And it's all out of pure selfishness. It's a horribly disgusting crime. It's a disgusting sin. No wonder St. Paul says that no adulterous person has any inheritance in the kingdom of God or Christ. So the sin of adultery is extremely grave. There is that carnal adultery. But again, the church also recognizes spiritual adultery. Carnal adultery is when one has marital relations with and breaks the marriage vows of oneself and or the other person. But spiritual adultery is when one is married and is a Catholic, then abandoning the faith and apostatizing from the faith, and let's say embracing some absolutely foreign faith, just leaving the faith and giving up its practice, and possibly even bringing in a different hostile faith into the family. That's called spiritual adultery. Either one of these forms of adultery, carnal or spiritual adultery, can give the right to the innocent spouse to leave. And in fact, if it's necessary to protect the children from the adultery and its consequences of the sinner, then they might have a moral obligation to actually take the children and go and get them away from that terrible influence of a spouse who has abandoned the faith and is trying to influence the children to give up the faith, or to get them away from the sinful spouse who's actually brought an alien person into them between the husband and wife in the family. And it's a terrible situation. It's very dangerous for the youngsters. They need to be protected from it. But unfortunately, the laws of our country, the civil laws, don't care. Often they just don't care. And they will force children to spend weekends living under the same roof with the adulterous husband or wife and their consort, and pretend the children are supposed to pretend that it's all okay. No wonder they have no loyalties. No wonder they grow up bitter and lost, these children. Just a horrible thing that adults do to them. Imagine a child who finds that his mommy and daddy have been broken up by some temptress, some woman who got between them, lured daddy away, and now his mommy and daddy are apart from each other, and he is living with some other person, and a court requires them to spend days with dad and this other woman who is not their mother. But these children are not supposed to care that she's making their sandwiches for their lunchbox or whatever, that she's putting dinner on the table for them. They're not supposed to care that she's putting Band-Aids on their scraped knees. They're not supposed to care that she's helping them brush their teeth. It doesn't matter. It's not supposed to matter to them. They're supposed to pretend that it doesn't matter whether it's their mom or not. It can be some other woman, any other woman daddy has a fancy for. Who cares? You know what that does to a child psychologically? It's awful. It kills something inside them. No wonder they grow up bitter, as I say, and sometimes just incapable of love. It's almost as though they're afraid to love and be loved because of the betrayal that has gone into it and the hurt that comes from it. It's a monstrous thing to do to a child. All of that is being put on the line by an adulterer. Sixth, they tell you here is birth control. And birth control, as I mentioned, so-called birth control. It's not really birth control, it's contraception. Well, birth control can be birth control if the child is conceived and then they murder the child by abortion. That's the most wicked form of birth control. But contraception, to sterilize oneself somehow in the marriage act and render it null and void, so it produces only pleasure, but no child. To do that wantonly, deliberately, by some artifice, again, is a mortal sin. 7, abortion. Well, there we go to the ultimate form of birth control. When a child is conceived, kill it. That's the ultimate statement that, look, my activity here, my intimacies are all about my own personal gratification. And not only do I want to avoid giving life, but where life is given, I will put it to death in the interests of my own freedom, my own sexual freedom, to do as I will. That is like the ultimate demonic selfishness of a person to resort to that. How absolutely horrible. It reminds one of the worshippers of Moloch who would offer their children as sacrifices to the devil god Moloch by having their children burned to death while they screamed in honor of Moloch. Well, here we are, we're back on that level right now. And number 8, sterilization. Again, some people say, well, the best way to avoid having children is just have it done once and for all. That still allows the marriage act, but renders it absolutely null and void, sterilizes it, so that no children need be feared, that they will somehow put a damper or a crimp in our enjoying each other in our lives. And again, that is a form of self-mutilation. It is a mortal sin to do that. Now here they give you little explanations, and I'll read through them in order to finish this chapter. Number 2, what is the marriage debt? The marriage debt means that a married person is obliged under penalty of mortal sin to give his or her married partner the marriage intimacies whenever it is reasonably asked for. They tell you here lawful excuses for refusing would be adultery, sickness, grave sickness, drunkenness. When one is drunk, he cannot make a rational or reasonable demand. Insanity, non-support, or danger to the baby in the womb. They give you these few reasons that would make rendering the marriage debt unreasonable, and obviously demanding the marriage debt unreasonable as well. Number 3, should a married person always insist on the right to intercourse? No, because a marriage cannot be successful unless it is founded on love and unselfishness. So in other words, when two people marry, they want to marry someone who's considerate of them and cares about them. So if a husband indicates to his wife that he would like to be husband to his wife that night, and the wife tells her husband she's not feeling well, she's not necessarily pushing away and saying, no, I refuse the marriage debt, just by telling him that she doesn't feel well. He might say, well, honey, this is very, very important to me, and I really need this from you right now for whatever reason, because of temptations that are attacking me or whatever. She would still have an obligation to render the marriage debt, unless her illness was really that grave. But most husbands would say, well, honey, I love you, and I'm not, you don't feel well, I understand that, so that's okay, that's perfectly okay with me. But beware of a spouse making excuses and taking advantage of the good nature of the other spouse. If someone finds out in the course of time that all he or she has to do is say, oh, honey, I'm so tired, or I'm busy, or I've got this in my mind, I'm not in the mood, whatever it is, and finds out that the other one takes that as just a refusal, and they're so considerate and so selfless, they will just say, "Oh, okay," and they give way. Then the one spouse could actually begin to use that as in the place of a refusal, and that would be mortally sinful, to take advantage of the other person's good nature just to express some inconvenience or unwillingness, and make the other spouse go away just because they're so meek, mild, and selfless. That could amount to an outright refusal. Number 4, why is it a mortal sin to separate from your partner? They say separation in a valid marriage is a mortal sin because, first of all, God said so. And secondly, to separate means to refuse the marriage debt. So when the one person leaves the other and abandons the other, that is to refuse them the rights that they have in marriage. As St. Paul says to the Corinthians, it can be done by mutual consent, but advisedly only for a time, lest temptation set in to seek gratification elsewhere. And they are meant to be there to prevent that happening from each other, to protect each other from that. Number 3, a separated person is tempted to commit adultery or some other sin, and that's true. And number 4, children cannot be properly trained if the husband and wife are broken up from each other. It's impossible to provide for them as they really need their mommy and daddy, and nobody can take mommy and daddy's place. Nobody. There are those who may try, but children need their mom and dad, and that is exactly why God set up the family as a society of the one man and one woman to be mother and father to these children. Number 5, is a validly married person ever allowed to separate from his or her spouse? The answer is yes, but only for a very serious reason, and only with permission. Yes, I tell you here, permission of the bishop. For the one to leave the other against his or her will, they would need permission. And here they say, ordinarily, in the former days, from the bishop to do that. Number 6, why is divorce and remarriage a mortal sin? Because it is clearly against the law of God. And again, they're citing 1 Corinthians chapter 10 here. Everyone who putteth away his wife and marrieth another committeth adultery. And he that marrieth her that is put away from her husband committeth adultery. This is from St. Luke's Gospel, chapter 16. Remember what St. Mark said in chapter 10. And here from 1 Corinthians, a woman is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if her husband dies, she is at liberty. Let her marry to whom she will, only in the Lord. So the point of St. Paul here is that the wife and the husband are bound together as long as they live. Number 7, may a separated or divorced person keep company with another person? The answer is no, not if the marriage is valid, because such a person is still married, and a married person is never allowed to keep company with another person of the opposite gender. That all too often takes the form of a date. So if you have someone who's even legitimately separated from a husband or wife, can that person frequent the company of another woman other than his wife from whom he's separated, or another man other than her husband from whom she is separated? The answer is no. He cannot do that legitimately. It would be scandalous for them to do so. It would be an occasion of sin, and probably a proximate occasion of mortal sin, for them to find a friendship there that is all too prone to become more than a friendship. You see, when a man and a woman marry each other, they're giving up any right to have a romantic relationship with anyone else in the world. And even if a man and a woman are separated from each other, they're still married. And they still cannot have romantic, even thoughts and inclinations toward another person. They have to refuse and reject those things. They can't be legitimately putting themselves in the state of mortal sin, let alone proximate occasion of mortal sin, by spending time with another person whom they find attractive, whom they find witty, whom they find interesting. That would be the death knell. That would be the absolute poison pill for their souls and the soul of another person as well. So it is not permitted for those who are married to keep company with someone of the opposite gender while they are married. And that includes also not only in the neighborhood, but that includes in the workplace too, which is one of the major problems we have in the American workplace now. Number 8, what is adultery? Adultery is sexual intercourse between a married person and someone to whom he or she is not married. And so as I mentioned, that's single adultery if only one of them is married. If they're both married to other people, that's double adultery. 9, what is the sin of birth control? Doing anything before, during, or after marital relations to keep the woman from becoming with child, to keep the woman from conceiving a child or carrying the child. And here we find St. Paul to the Hebrews, chapter 13. Marriage honorable in all, and the marriage bed undefiled. And then Genesis, chapter 38. He, Onan, when he went into his deceased brother's wife, did lose his seed, lest he give her children who would be actually attributed to his older deceased brother, to keep that family line alive. He would not do that, and so he indulged in this impure act with this woman, and that is a mortal sin. Number 10, is birth control ever allowed by God? The answer is no. It is always a mortal sin. In other words, to indulge in marital relations with the purpose and the plan to avoid conceiving a child by artificial means, by things that the human being, the individuals do, whatever they may be, to prevent that a child be conceived, would be birth control, and it's always wrong. It always perverts the marital act. Number 11, what is the sin of abortion? It is the killing of an unborn baby. It is against the 5th commandment. 12, is abortion ever allowed to save a mother's life? And the answer is no. You cannot directly take the life of an innocent person for any reason whatsoever. Even if it were a matter of saving one's own life or saving an entire nation worth of people. You cannot murder someone in order to save other people. It's still murder. Anyway, we could go into examples. The situation ethics people always come up with situations that are very, very extreme to make you think, well, there must be some time when it would be okay to murder somebody to save another person, or 10 other people's lives, or 100 other people's lives, or 1,000 other people's lives, just to kill them and have done with it. But it's still murder. To directly put to death or take the life of an innocent person is still murder. Now, I mentioned in another video the principle of double effect, where you have no choice but to take action which is going to ultimately lead to a death. Someone is going to be injured or perhaps killed, and you have no choice but to alternatives of action that are going to lead to someone dying. But what you do, the action you take, is not to kill someone. It is to avoid killing. It is to avoid killing someone. And if the result is indirectly, that is not your will, that someone be killed by it, even though you foresee it, it's not what you intend, and you would avoid it if you were any way possible to avoid it, that means it is not voluntary on your part. But that's not what we're talking about here with abortion. We're talking about the deliberate, designed, malice aforethought effort to put to death the child. Number 13, what happens to a Catholic who knowingly has an abortion? The result is, by the law of God, mortal sin, by the law of the Church, automatic excommunication. And that automatic excommunication, in former times, well, that was actually treated very, very seriously. If someone went into the confessional to confess that they had an abortion, or had done an abortion, in extreme cases, the priest, for whatever reason the case might be, could possibly grant absolution in the internal forum, but the person would be excommunicated from the church, would have to be informed that he was excommunicated from the church, and that excommunication would have to be lifted by church authority. The priest would not have the authority to lift that excommunication. And usually the priest would not even give absolution if the person were penitent, but would wait to hear the ruling of the church authority. They'd have to go through channels, in other words, to have the excommunication lifted. The reason being is because performing the abortion is very much a public act, however private it may be and however secret it may be. It involves another life. It involves a number of people who know what happened, and so it is not necessarily an occult act. It can easily become notorious, and it is also scandalous, gravely scandalous. Because of that, the individuals involved, the one who had the abortion, the one who did the abortion, the one who paid for the abortion, or whatever else, those people must make some kind of public reparation and must somehow offset the scandal by publicly repenting of what they've done and letting everyone know that what they did was very evil and it was wrong, and making sure that everyone they might have influenced badly is set straight on the fact that they now condemn what they did. Number 15, what is sterilization? Number 14, can an excommunicated person get back into the church? Yes, of course he has to be truly sorry, with genuine contrition for having committed the crime. He has to hate the evil that he did. And it says here, the priest who hears his confession has to get special power from the bishop to take away the excommunication. Again, he has to wait for the ruling of the governing authority in the church. Number 15, what is sterilization? Making the reproductive organs unfruitful, usually by tying or cutting or tying, or removing the parts of the body that are necessary for the conception of a child or the continued life of the child. Anything that does that mutilates the person in their reproductive organs such that it renders them incapable of giving life, that is sterilization. It is very evil. Number 16, what kind of sin is sterilization? Always a mortal sin, unless the organs are diseased and must be removed because they are a danger to the health of the whole body. Well, again, this gets back to what is called the indirect voluntary, or the principle of double effect. If one of the organs necessary for giving life is diseased, cancerous, let's say, and has to be removed, it's not being removed in order to prevent life, it's being removed in order to preserve life. And because there is a pathological condition here. The result will be that, yes, the one person is rendered sterile and incapable of transmitting life. That's true. But that was not the intention. It was just the indirect voluntary in the sense that they accepted the consequences, but it wasn't what they wanted. They have truly a pathological condition that needed to be treated, and this was the only way it could be effectively treated. And so they would have a right to have this done. They mention a woman is never allowed to have her tubes tied, or a man allowed to have a vasectomy under any conditions, even under doctor's orders. If there has to be some kind of pathology there that would require it. If there is serious danger to the woman's life or health, the only solution in accord with God's law is to refrain from marital intercourse, totally or periodically. In other words, sometimes doctors will say, if you become with child again, your life will be in danger, and you could lose the child and your own life too. Well, many times doctors, unfortunately, scare the ladies into thinking, you must never have another child because if you do, you are in danger of death. And how many times do valiant women just leave themselves in the hands of God, go on and have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more children with no ill effects, because God provides. It seems that many doctors these days are very anti-life, and they consider it to be as though they're on a mission in order to prevent children. Sad to say, you hear stories about it all the time, and it seems that many doctors out there are, Hippocrates would be very ashamed of them. They're certainly not living up to the standard of what a true physician should be, who loves life, preserves it, and would see to it that it is multiplied and shared. In any case, the practical points. Number one, the sins discussed in this lesson are against the law of God and are therefore forbidden to everyone, not just to Catholics. These are not just church laws that concern Catholics alone. These are natural law here. They are the law of all of our human nature. It applies to every single one of us here. Number two, if lack of money or poor health make it difficult for you to have children, consider that this is the cross that our Lord wants you to carry, and that He will give you the strength to carry it. Perhaps you do not have the means to bring children into the world. Perhaps you don't have means to support those children. And it's very important to have the income and the necessary wherewithal to provide food and clothing and shelter and all the other things that are required today to raise a family. So a man who marries has to be thinking of these things, that he's got to provide these things before they're married, not thinking about how he's going to provide them after they're married. In fact, it would be reckless for a priest to marry a couple who have no visible means of support. And so, but a couple who cannot conceive children, well, perhaps God is asking them to adopt children. There are many children in the world who desperately need a mom and a dad who will love them. And perhaps this is their vocation. And oddly enough, it seems to happen fairly commonly that a couple might be married for 3, 5, even 10 years and not have children, adopt a child, and then they conceive a child of their own. And evidently God is rewarding them for having taken in the homeless. Number 3, for a truly serious reason, for example, if the mother's life would be endangered by pregnancy, it is not against God's law for a couple to practice periodic continence, that is, to have marital relations only during the woman's infertile time each month. This practice, however, is allowed only, well, first of all, there has to be mutual consent, because they both have the right to demand the marriage debt. And secondly, if it is not an occasion of sin and puts one of them, or the other of them, or both of them, in danger of being tempted to do something outside the marriage act, which is wrong. And 3, for a sufficiently grave reason. Pope Pius XII actually spoke about this very subject. He gave an allocution to midwives back in 1951 in the Vatican, I think it was 51. And he actually explained some reasons that could be justification for practicing what they call natural family planning. He mentioned, for example, if the husband and wife discover that they have a propensity for bringing children into the world who are somehow impaired mentally or physically, that they do not have the means whereby to feed, clothe, and shelter even the children they have, let alone another one, because of poverty, that the wife's health is so poor that her life could be endangered by another pregnancy, or she could become so incapacitated she could not take care of the children that she has. These could be justification for practicing natural family planning. But notice one thing, they all involve fathers and mothers who are already fathers and mothers. They already involve husband and wife who have given life to children. It presupposes they've already had some children. And the other thing to notice is that the couple are not allowed to decide for themselves whether they qualify to practice natural family planning. They should go to the parish priest and ask him, what is the teaching of the Church about this? Does it apply to us? So with clear conscience, they can then do what the priest says. And the priest takes upon himself the responsibility then for the answer that he gave. But the married couple, well, they can follow his advice as long as they believe it to be reliable. Number 4, expectant mothers should be careful about signing papers in the hospital, because they could be signing papers to allow hospital staff to do things to them that would be immoral and would even kill a child. Number 5, women having abdominal operations should tell the doctor not to do things to them other than what they have prescribed. In other words, I guess at times in the past, doctors would take liberties, and while they were doing operations, they might tamper with the organs, and they must be absolutely forbidden to do that. Number 6, birth control pills often work by causing early abortion. This is something, again, that doctors will not always tell the truth about. Birth control pills have a kind of a fail-safe component that even if a child is conceived, they prevent the child from joining with the mother's body and living. And what they do result in is that the child might be conceived and then aborted. How often does this happen? That depends upon the women, depends upon the pill. But the fact is, it does happen. And the sad thing is that there might be many people out there, unfortunately, conservative North Sort of Catholics, who are being told that it's perfectly okay, and many non-Catholics, Protestants, who think that the birth control pill is the answer because they would never have abortions. So the birth control pill makes it unnecessary for them to have abortions. But the fact is, they would be horrified to find out that they're aborting their babies because of the pill. They are aborting. They're not being prevented from conceiving the children. They're conceiving children, and they're aborting them. Again, how often? It depends on how often they have intercourse with their husbands, how often they... It depends on the woman, and it depends upon the pill that they're using, and all these things that factor together. It's not a question of really how often, it's a question of whether, and the answer is yes. The birth control pill can serve as an abortifacient, which makes it doubly evil. Well, in any case, we finished this chapter 30. We'll go on to chapter 31, and that is the sacrament of matrimony now. So I ask you, please, if you are married, to renew your marriage vows in your heart and mind. Renew your commitment to our Lord to be faithful to each other in the marriage. Remember, it is a life of service. It is a vocation that you rendered first of all to God. So ask Almighty God for the actual graces you need, the grace of state to be faithful to your spouses and to your children, and to help each other save your souls, even as you are save each other's souls, even as you're saving your own souls. If you are not married but hope to be, pray to Almighty God to provide you with the real spouse that God wants you to have, and the wisdom to recognize the spouse that God wants you to have. Pray for that grace. And don't settle for anything less. And if you are not called to the married state, again, be grateful to God for the grace that He's giving you to practice chastity in life as a single person or as a consecrated person. St. Paul actually advised people in his day not to marry. He discouraged them from marrying. He said they should marry if they need to marry. They can't remain chaste otherwise. But he discouraged them from marriage. And that's not because St. Paul did not appreciate the love and the beauty of marriage, but he saw that they were in a time of persecution. He saw that in times of persecution, it was a great danger, because to be married, to have a wife and children, to have a husband and children, created ties that would be very, very difficult for a person to live with and, if necessary, die with in fidelity. There were many martyrs who gave their lives, who were husbands and wives, mothers and fathers and children, but they had to contend with these natural bonds of love between their husbands and fathers and mothers and wives and so on, who were pleading with them to save themselves and to give up the faith. It's a great tribute to these great martyrs at that time that they were able to choose Christ first and love Him most of all. But it was very hard. It put pressure on them. As St. Paul says, a man who's married seeks to please his wife. That's his first thought, it seems. And the wife who's married, she's concerned about pleasing her husband. And whereas one who's not married can concentrate uniquely on pleasing our Lord. Well, we are entering a time, perhaps, of persecution now. I think the persecution is already well underway, frankly. And we are entering a time that might very well be akin to the time St. Paul was facing back in his day, when he advised people to seek the single or the consecrated life rather than the married life, because he knew that the ties there would be possible entanglements that would endanger one's soul. I would say this, though: it depends on what God is calling you to. It all depends on what God is calling you to. So discerning that, what your calling is from God, what life He wants you to live, what service He wants you to render Him in this life, is the single most important thing you need to know as you're approaching your adult years and you have to make the decision of what course to take. So I beg you to pray seriously, to attend Mass, receive the sacraments regularly, remain in the state of grace, and beg God to enlighten your mind and strengthen your will, that you may know what your vocation is and you may have the strength to pursue it. God bless you.